name's Robin Stevenson. I live on Vancouver Island with my partner, our teenage son, a dog, and a cat. As a kid, I was very much an avid reader. I pretty much read all the time. I was born in England and grew up mostly in Ontario. We moved around quite a lot when I was a kid, and I was a real bookworm. And I loved reading, but I also loved making up stories in my head. When I was maybe 10 or 11, I remember thinking that I wanted to be a writer someday, but I didn't actually start writing seriously until I was in my 30s, after my son was born. And I would just walk around town with my baby in a stroller, and I started keeping a notebook under the stroller. And whenever my baby went to sleep, I would just sit down wherever I happened to be and start writing in this notebook. And I pretty quickly got hooked on writing. And after my son went to bed at night, I would start typing those stories into the computer. And it sort of grew and grew, and I thought perhaps this could work as a children's book. So I sent it to a friend, and she gave me some feedback, and she was very encouraging. And so I sent it off to a publisher, and I was just very lucky. I got a call back from Orca saying they were interested in publishing the book, and just never really looked back from there. So over the last 15 years, I've written 29 books for kids and teens, both fiction and nonfiction, and they range from books for kids as young as babies and toddlers up through books for teenagers. Well, I haven't actually done much writing so far, but of course I do have plenty of unread books in my house, the whole bookshelf's full, so I'm in no danger of running out of reading material, and I'm hoping that spending some time reading will recharge the writing batteries, and that I will soon be spending some of this time writing. In the meantime, though, I've been doing some gardening, and feeling very lucky to have a backyard at the moment and to be able to spend time outside. So my partner and I have thinned out the bamboo and used the stalks we cut down to build a fence. We planted a garden bed, planted peas and cucumber and lettuce and carrots, and hopefully the little fence we've made will keep it all safe from the dog, because he is a little spaniel who likes to eat everything. In fact, we have some blueberry bushes back there, and we never get any blueberries because he always eats them all before they actually are quite ripe. So we didn't want to take any chances with our new vegetable garden. What else do I do? Well, I like to take the dog for walks around the neighborhood. That's pretty much the only time I go out is to walk the dog. For a couple of weeks, we were actually in quarantine. We had returned from traveling and weren't able to go anywhere for the first couple of weeks and couldn't even walk the dog. So I was trying to keep him entertained and exercised by teaching him some new agility tricks in the backyard and some hide and seek games with him in the house. So that's been fun. I don't actually think there is one. I think that, you need to read what you want to read, and that's going to be different for different people. You might feel like revisiting some of your old favorites, perhaps rereading a series that you love. When I was a kid, that would have been The Lord of the Rings. I probably read The Lord of the Rings, once or twice a year for a number of years, and really knew those books off by heart. It was real comfort reading for me. For my son, it would probably be Harry Potter that he's read over and over again. Actually, I wouldn't mind rereading those ones again myself. I'm kind of a fan. Or you might be in the mood for discovering something new, whether that's escapist fantasy or dystopia or humor or graphic novels, memoir, maybe true stories about people living through difficult times, maybe classic science fiction. There's so many good books out there, and I think I hope that you can all find something that will hold your attention and give you hours of reading pleasure, whatever that is. And I'm certainly always very happy to recommend books to people. So feel free to reach out to me on social media, and if you tell me about a few books that you have really loved, I'll try to recommend some more books that are kind of in that same vein. I would say just write. Write what you want to write, not what you think you should write. Don't feel you have to share what you're writing with others unless you choose to, unless you want to. Don't stress about it not being good enough, and especially don't put too much pressure on yourself when you're writing a first draft. keep in mind that the books that you love, the books that you read, that you pick up off the shelf, those are books that the author has rewritten usually many times. They've also been worked on by an editor and gone through usually several rounds of editing, copy editing, proofreading. The first draft probably looked very different and probably looked pretty rough. I know my own first drafts are very, very messy and imperfect. So I think it's important not to be too much of a perfectionist when you're trying to get that first draft down, and just to give yourself permission to tell the story, to let it be rough, to let it be messy, and to trust that you can go back and fix it when you revise if you want to. But I would say enjoy the process. Focus more on the journey rather than the finish line. You're going to learn a lot from every story that you write, even the ones that you don't end up actually finishing. The more you write, the better your writing is going to get. And if you don't know where to begin, if you think you'd like to spend some time writing but you don't know where to start, look up writing prompts online or writing exercises online. There's some really great writing prompts that you can find that can give you a jumping off point. And even if you don't like the first, few paragraphs you write, just keep going, and sooner or later you'll have an idea or a sentence or something that you think, okay, actually this is something I want to focus on or pursue, and you can jump off from that point as well. So just give yourself permission to get words down on paper and not worry too much about getting them right initially. For me, the most difficult part of writing is usually the middle of each book. I love starting new projects, I love creating characters and following them into all kinds of predicaments, but usually somewhere around the midpoint I get stuck and I get discouraged, and it's really tempting just to give up and start something new. So I have to force myself to keep going through that hard part, even if I feel like I'm writing garbage. It does help to remind myself that I can go back and fix it after I get a first draft done, and to remind myself that I have felt this way before. In fact, I have felt this way in the middle of pretty much every book I've ever written. And so just remembering that is just kind of part of the process. It doesn't mean that the book is not going to work out. Helps me to keep going with it. I think the other thing that can be difficult, and this isn't so much about writing as it is about being an author, is balancing multiple projects and demands. Publishing is a really slow process. By the time you sign a contract for a book, it's probably going to be still another year or two before that book comes out, which means that most writers end up juggling multiple projects at once, all in different stages. And it can be a lot to keep track of. If a first draft of a new book is going really well, it can be hard to put it aside. If you're really immersed in it, the last thing you want to do is stop working on that to work on edits. But if you have a deadline for a different project, you need to switch gears and do that. Or if you're working on a book and it's going well, and but you have another book coming out and you have to go on tour and do events and talk about the book that's just coming out, when really your mind is kind of full of the one that you're currently working on. So that's always a piece that I find challenging as well. There's lots of parts of being a writer that aren't actually about writing. And some of those are things that I love, like visiting schools, teaching writing, talking to people about books and about creative writing. And some of them are parts that I don't particularly like, such as updating my website, which I'm not very good at doing. Well, there are many. First of all, I love the feeling of writing when it's going really well. I love creating characters and following them around and getting to know them better and seeing them come to life and seeing what kinds of predicaments they find themselves in. I love crafting sentences and scenes. I love returning to a finished first draft and rereading it and figuring out how I can go back into that world and make it better. But I also like a lot of the other things about being a writer. I really like being able to work from home. I like that I can set my own schedule, that I can work, in my kitchen with the dog at my feet or in a coffee shop. I like not having an office. I like that I don't have a boss. I don't have meetings to go to. I have a lot of control over how and when I do my work, and that really works for me. I do love visiting schools. I like talking to kids. I find when I do have opportunities to visit schools and talk about writing, although in some ways it can be tiring being on tour, it's also really energizing, and it's always gives me more inspiration. It always gives me more of a desire to go home and work on the next book, and kind of remind me of why I write books in the first place, and that it's because there are young people out there who want those stories and who read those books and to whom those books are important. And I love that I give that I have the opportunity to travel. That's not something that I really anticipated when I started writing. I didn't realize that writers got opportunities to travel, so that's really cool. And I love that I get to be a part of a wonderful community of book people, readers, writers, librarians, teachers, booksellers, bloggers, publishing folks, just all kinds of people who love books. And that's a wonderful community to get to be a part of. So I definitely love that side of being a writer as well. That's actually a hard question because there were so many books that I really loved and I couldn't possibly pick just one. So I'm going to mention a few that were important to me. One of those was Emily of New Moon. Emily of New Moon is by Lucy Maud Montgomery, so the same person who wrote Anne of Green Gables. The Emily series is not as well known as the Anne series, and I did love both, but Emily was my favorite. And Emily is a girl who wants to be a writer. So when I was 10 or 11 or so and thinking that I wanted to be a writer someday, I remember reading those books about Emily and making the same vow that she made, that one day she would write a novel. So those were really important to me. I really related to that character in a lot of ways. I also really loved The Lord of the Rings, as I mentioned earlier, that I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings over and over again. In fact, when I was in about grade 8, I joined a Hobbit club at school, and for 1 year, instead of doing the regular English curriculum, all I did was write essays about The Lord of the Rings, which was pretty cool. I think I wrote about 10 essays about The Lord of the Rings, so that was pretty great. Other books I loved were A Wrinkle in Time and Harriet the Spy. And I also read a lot of very dated British books set in boarding schools, and a lot of books about horses. I really loved horse books. No, I didn't anticipate this change at all. The original book was called Pride, Celebrating Diversity and Community, and it came out in 2016. And it was my first non-fiction book. And one thing that I discovered, and there's an important difference between fiction and nonfiction, is that nonfiction becomes out of date in a way that fiction does not. Many of the novels I read and loved were written 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It doesn't matter. But nonfiction, of course, even by the time the book's published, there's going to be small things that are becoming inaccurate. So I was very happy to have the opportunity to go back and update it and make sure that everything in the book was current and accurate. But we decided that rather than just update it, we would also use the opportunity for me to expand the book and add to it. And so the new version is called Pride, the Celebration and the Struggle. It's quite a bit longer than the original. When I actually got the finished copy and held it in my hand, I was surprised by how fat it is. It's a much fatter book than the original, so that was kind of satisfying. And I also added some sections throughout, and I added a whole extra 5th chapter as well, which focuses on activism. And one of the really cool things about getting to do this was that I met a lot of people as a result of the original book, and some of those were young people who are young activists, and I was actually able to include some of their stories about their activism in the second edition of the book. So that felt very full circle and very satisfying. Yeah. When I wrote my first book 15 years ago, I drew very heavily on my own experiences and memories of being a queer teen, and a queer teen who wasn't out. And of course, this was a long time ago. I was in high school in the 1980s, and at that time we really didn't talk about LGBTQ plus issues or identities at all, and never saw LGBTQ plus characters in books, and really didn't even have the language I would have needed to talk about those issues as a younger teen. So it was a very challenging time in many ways, and I drew on that when I wrote my book Out of Order. It's about a bisexual teen, Sophie, who is just beginning to figure out who she is in the world. And because of that book, I started hearing from readers to whom it had been really important to see a book about a character who was figuring out their sexual orientation, who was sort of coming to terms with who they were, how they identified. And so I began, I continued to include LGBTQ plus characters in the next books that I had coming out over the next few years, and continued to hear from readers who really let me know how important that was to them. So it's also, to me, a reflection of the world I live in. It would be hard for me to write books without LGBTQ plus characters, because my world, my life, includes so many people who are LGBTQ plus. It would be strange to write books that did not. And of course, it's not just LGBTQ plus readers who need these books. I think it's important as well for readers who don't know many LGBTQ plus people, who may be encountering these people for the first time through books, and hopefully that helps them to have more understanding, to be more comfortable, to have more empathy, to care more about issues of human rights as they affect LGBTQ plus people. So although I started out writing for teens, I've also written for younger kids, and over the last few years I've started to write more LGBTQ plus books for middle grade kids and for younger kids, babies, toddlers as well. Partly that's because I'm a parent. My kid has 2 moms, and he has very rarely seen families like ours in the books that he reads, and so that was important to me to write books that show diverse families. And also because I visit schools, because I talk to kids about LGBTQ plus issues, I meet many kids who are still scared to come out, who worry that their parents will be not supportive, will be upset or disappointed or angry. And I think it's so important that kids get the message from their parents that it is okay for them to be who they are, and that whoever they are, whoever they grow up to be, they will always be loved and supported. And so when I wrote Pride Colors, which is my board book for small kids, that was the message that I wanted that book to convey. Another issue that I'm pretty passionate about is refugee rights. Over the last few years, I've sponsored a number of refugees to come to Canada, and I've become increasingly involved in refugee advocacy issues. So I wrote Ghost's Journey, a refugee story, as a picture book, but I think it's actually a good book for older kids as well. And it tells the story of 2 gay men, Rainer and Eka, who come to Canada from Indonesia, along with their cat Ghost. The illustrations are actually based on photographs that Rainer took. And it's a book that I wrote to raise awareness of the challenges faced by LGBTQ plus people around the world. And my hope is that it can be used in classrooms as a gentle introduction to refugee issues, to human rights issues, and to the challenges still faced by LGBTQ plus communities in many countries. All my royalties from that book go to support LGBTQ plus refugees, so I'm very much hoping that as well as raising awareness, that it can also raise funds for some of the important work that's happening in that area. In terms of backlash, yeah, I have definitely experienced some backlash for writing about these issues, but I have to say I have experienced so much more support than I have opposition. Regardless, though, I think these books are needed. I think young people need them, and I don't like to let fears about backlash influence my decisions about what I write. In fact, I would say that every time I encounter backlash, it just reinforces and underscores, why we need these books and why they're important. So I'll certainly continue to write about LGBTQ plus issues and characters. First of all, reading aloud is something that I loved as a kid and that I love as a parent. And I read aloud to my kid every evening up until he was a teenager. And I still would if I could. I loved reading aloud with him. And so if that's something that a parent or teacher enjoys and the child enjoys, I would definitely recommend reading aloud. Or even just reading, if your kid's older, even reading the same book, recommending books to each other, reading the same books so that you can talk about those books, talk about the themes that come up. One book that I think would be that I'll mention specifically that I think would be a great one for parents or teachers to use at the moment to engage young readers would be Kid Activists. It would be a really useful book for kids who are learning at home at the moment, I think. Each chapter introduces a different person whose activism focused on a particular issue. For example, Frederick Douglass and the abolition of slavery, Susan B. Anthony and women's right to vote, Nelson Mandela and Ending Apartheid in South Africa, Harvey Milk and Gay Rights, and so on. And I think each chapter provides a great jumping off point for discussion and for further exploration through reading, documentaries, and so on. So, for example, a young reader who was interested in learning about Martin Luther King Jr.'s childhood and enjoyed that chapter of the book might like to go on to read some longer biographies about his life and his work. Or if they prefer fiction, to read some novels that are set during that era that explore some of the issues like segregation, like the civil rights movement. A few that I would recommend would be The Parker Inheritance by Marion Johnson, or The Washingtons Go to Birmingham by Christopher Paul Curtis, or John Lewis's graphic memoir, March, would be a really great choice as well. They could watch documentaries about the civil rights movement. They could listen to some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches. And from there, they could explore some tangents and learn about other civil rights activists like Rosa Parks, Ruby Bridges, Little Rock Nine, and so on, who are also included in my book, Kid Activists. I think young readers could also explore activism in their own lives, thinking about what are some of the issues that they care about, what problems do they see in their own communities, what kinds of things can they do to try to make things better. And there are so many ways of working for change. For example, a kid who's really passionate about the environment might start a group online to connect with other kids who share that interest. They might write letters to local politicians or to provincial or federal government. They might make art or take photos and share those online as a way of raising awareness of an issue they care about. They could make and sell environmentally friendly alternatives to shopping bags or to cleaning products. They could start a website or a blog. They could record videos. They could make a computer game about environmental themes. They could write a book. So just looking at ways that they can use the book as a starting point and then take that off in different directions depending on what their interests are. Well, I have a teen novel that I co-wrote with my friend Tom Ryan. It's called When You Get the Chance, and it was supposed to be coming out in May, but it has actually been postponed for a year, so because of the pandemic. So we're now going to be launching that book in the spring of 2021. It's a teen novel about two cousins who, like me and Tom, are from opposite coasts of Canada. I'm on the west coast, Tom's from the east coast, and so are Mark and Talia in our book. The two cousins are reunited in Toronto at their grandfather's funeral, and various adventures ensue, both in Ontario's cottage country and at Toronto Pride. So it was a lot of fun to write. We wrote it all online because we live in different cities, so we wrote it by sending chapters back and forth and building on each other's chapters, and it was a lot of fun to write. I would really encourage young people who like writing to think about doing a co-authoring a project with someone. It was a lot of fun. Anyway, so that one now comes out in May 2021, which means I will have 3 books coming out at the same time that season. The other 2 are a picture book called Pride Puppy. It's the first picture book I've done which is fully illustrated by an artist, so I'm really excited to see the artwork that she comes up with and what that book's going to look like. And the other book I have coming out next spring is the next book in the Kid Legends series, so the same series that Kid Activists is part of. And that one is called Kid Innovators, and it's about the childhood lives of 16 different inventors and entrepreneurs. And it's been really interesting to do the research and writing for that book. I've learned a lot about all kinds of interesting people, so I'm looking forward to being able to share that book with young readers. I'm also working very slowly on an adult mystery. And I'm also just starting a new middle grade novel, but I don't really even know enough about that one yet to say anything about it. I'm just slowly kind of feeling my way into the story and figuring out what that book's going to be about. Yeah. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. Thanks so much. Bye.